Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering Mage Errant Book 4, The Lost City of Ithos. Chapters 6 through 10, Ampioch, Helicote, The Rising Cormorant, Old Philosophies, and Unfortunate Dietary Choices. In these chapters, we find out some of what the deal might be with Alustin. And I will tell you what, kids, I really just kind of want a Alustin side story book. Like, just, I don't know. I just want it. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you so much to Dan for commissioning this episode. What's up, Dan? Reminder that this is the last of the Mage Errant episodes for a few weeks, so there will be a dead spot in there, but fear not, I will be back. But these chapters are really, like, there's so much in here that I found moving, actually. And I feel like this author is really going out of his way to address like a variety of different behavioral issues that people might have and why, and include them without necessarily turning them into like jerks for it, but at least acknowledging some of the ways that people operate and why. And I am really enjoying seeing this all play out. But first, with chapter 6, we have got to finish up the battle. So chapter 5 ended with "Have a nice flight," and I swear to God, I really did just think that the Needle of Leagues was dead. I just took it for granted that shit worked, and I don't know why I thought it likely that these kids would be able to take out a sacred swordsman who is obviously a massive badass, except that I have grown sort of used to them being able to do more than anybody would expect of them, I think. I really think that's all it is. It's just like anybody they go up against, I figure they're going to be a match for. And I should have thought about the fact that they're not alone here. You know, it's one thing if they come up against somebody like this in a scenario where there's no help to be had, that probably then they're going up against somebody that they will manage to triumph over. But here, we're out in the street. We've got Alustin. We've got Arthur. Like, you know, I should have realized that probably it was not going to just come down to our main crew of kids. But anyway, there is, Sanaya is her name, and Sanaya, like, recovers from this explosion, doesn't even seem really particularly, like, bothered by it. There's just, like, damaged armor, but otherwise she seems fine. And Sabe is heading towards her, and Sanaya just, like, fucking slaps her aside, kind of, but with lightning. That's like the feeling of it for me, is just the way that she uses her crazy harpoon. It does feel like kind of just a slap to get her out of the way. And Sabe winds up hitting the water and not coming up again, which starts to make Hugh really nervous. And I was also a little bit nervous. I was like certain that Sabe wasn't going to die or anything. But I was kind of curious, like, what kind of potential injuries there could be, forgetting about the fact that she can do water armor and stuff, and probably that would lend itself perfectly to this scenario. So then Alustin appears, and the Needle of Leagues, strained against a sword in Alustin's hands, an odd-looking blade with a slight curve that Hugh had never seen before, covered in a truly absurd number of spell forms. In a swirl of paper, he leapt after her, and they began exchanging blows rapidly. Glyph-inscribed papers intercepted lightning bolts, and burning bits of paper filled the air around the two. Then the spell forms on Alustin's sword began to glow, and it began to leave translucent afterimages floating in its wake, almost like visible echoes. "I can't," Godric started, then simply trailed off. And I think what he was going to say was like, "I can't believe it," because he knows what this sword is, like the significance of it. And let's see, the harpoon hit one of the afterimages and simply bounced right off. The afterimage dissolved a moment later, but Alustin was already on the offensive. So he's going forward, and there's like more of these afterimages that are building up. And then, defying all logic, she simply stepped forward into the wall of hanging blades, or more lurched than stepped. The floating swords cut through Sanaya's armor like it were warm butter, and one of her arms was severed entirely, crashing to the ground. And that image of like losing a limb when you're that high up in the air, there is something so undignified about that, you know, just your fucking arm by itself flapping and hitting the ground. And she crumples, and everybody is realizing, oh, we're out of this, we're okay. And then something is coming up out of the water, and he was starting to be like, oh my God, I thought things were all right. What is this now? And it turns out that this is Ampioch. And I'll tell you what, guys, I was listening to the audiobook, and the first sentence after this little break is, Ampioch was an octopus. And I literally just said out loud, nice. Like, I was really, truly excited about this. It's just one of those things that anytime that you include a big, particularly odd animal, it's a fun thing, you know? And it's one thing, we've got a sphinx, we've got a dragon, and all of that feels like well and good. We had a big turtle as well, but like an octopus is pretty dope. You can't be mad about an octopus. And it was really funny today too, because, well, not today specifically, but like this last weekend, Rashawn and I recorded on, we recorded an unsober episode. For those who are not aware, if you become a patron at the $20 level, at the $5 level, you get access to the Sookie Stackhouse series coverage, which I'm doing with my friend Miles, which is really, really fun. But if you are a $20 and up, you get me and Rashawn twice a month talking about a random topic for 2 hours live on camera. And they're really fun to do. And we pick weird topics sometimes. The last one we did, though, was a part 2 on animal facts, because I found this list of genuinely astonishing facts about animals. And one of them was the fact that octopuses, I can't remember what the actual plural is supposed to be, that they have technically got 9 brains. And it's not, like quite brains, but it's each of the arms has its own sort of like node of nerves that is functionally very much like a brain, but in a basic way. Octopuses, that's the plural, okay. And so the fact that he can create different enchantments from each arm tracks, actually, like that. Scientifically speaking, if we were doing this in the way that you would think, then it works. And I just really enjoy that. I wouldn't have fully appreciated the relevance of the description of how he uses his magic to real world octopuses until I found that fact out. So if I hadn't read this, if I read this before that Unsober, it would have kind of sailed right over my head. But anyway, He was the single biggest creature Hugh had ever seen. The immense red octopus must have been half again the length of Indra's Stormbreaker. He took up a considerable portion of the harbor by himself, and what Hugh could see of the octopus's arms looked big enough to tear a ship in half. Now, this confused me a little bit. Must have been half again the length of Indra's Stormbreaker. So that is basically 1.5 Indra Stormbreakers is that wording. Like it caught me up for a second. So even bigger than Indra's. That is crazy enough. And the way that this creature communicates is by writing, question mark, is that the way I want to say it? Displaying, at the very least, words on his skin, because he can change colors, you know? And Hugh notices everybody bowing and immediately is like, oh shit, and starts to do it as well. And then he just puts first word is explain. And Alustin has to introduce himself. And he says basically, really sorry about this. We were not the aggressors. We were attacked. They came at us in the street. I know we've done a lot of damage, and I think that it would be fair if you guys kept these extremely valuable weapons in exchange to pay for the damages. And Hugh is feeling a little bit salty because he was like, well, we worked for those. We killed them. But Amphiak is pleased with this arrangement. And let's see, the tip reached out and clenched the needle of leagues with one of the suckers on its underside and slowly withdrew it under the water. There's another sword up in your new forest buried under a mound of mostly molten lead, Alustin said. The letters on Amphiak's skin faded, but none replaced them immediately. Hugh wasn't sure, but he thought the octopus's skin had grown a little less red. And that's something that I enjoy about this as well, is that Amphiak's coloring changes according to his mood. So there's a point at which he's like expressing regret, and it's almost like the expression on your face, you know? You give a little frown, a little creasing of the brows together, like, oh. And you do that with the movement of the muscles of your face, but he doesn't have that sort of like expressiveness. So he does it with color. And I think that's a really cool idea. I don't know. And Arthur shows up, takes the sword and slides it toward the edge of the pier. If I had been in the harbor rather than out hunting, I could have ended this incident immediately, Amphiak said. Have you considered my offer, Arthur? I'm sorry, Amphiak. I simply have too many bad memories of Lothal, and we don't know what this offer is, but suffice to say, I assume we will find out eventually what it is. He asks how long they intend to stay, and Alustin's figuring a couple days, probably tops. And he picked Sabe up off the broken column and set her down gently next to the others. Sabe squeaked a little, but looked more surprised than anything. And I was like, yeah, you could squeak over being picked up by a giant, incredibly powerful octopus. That is banana pants. So he turns away and turns white, like white, described as eggshell white. Broken basalt pillars began lifting themselves out of the water, their cracks fusing together. As Alustin escorted them away from the lower harbor, Hugh looked back to see the destroyed pier reassembling itself. One of Amphiak's great eyes flicked upward and met Hugh's gaze. He couldn't even begin to guess what lay behind that inscrutable alien gaze. And I was sort of like, what is he looking at Hugh for? Like, the fact that he makes eye contact like that, I don't know. Something about that felt kind of significant to me. Like, how many people do you think he actually bothers looking at when you're like that powerful and that size? By the time they reach the inn, like tons of stuff has begun to restore itself and repair. And Sabe, we're in her perspective for this little section here, is just kind of like, I have never seen anything like that. This shit is, the amount of power that's going into this is banana pants. And it turns out he's a basalt mage. And Alestin says, strictly speaking, he's 9 basalt mages. Each of his arms has their own mana reservoirs and can semi-independently spellcast. Ampiak more coordinates and guides his arms than controls them. They are usually well-behaved. It's complicated. Ampiak's arms are the reason there are so many cults in Lethal. You can't swing a stick without encountering another one worshipping this arm or that. And I will tell you what, kids, the idea that there are cultists who don't even worship, like, the overall creature, but worship his arms, that's hysterical to me. That's just really funny. I'm sorry, but that's just very funny. So anyway, I want to mention something. Sabe is looking at Hugh and noticing that for the moment, he seems to be doing okay. And she's realizing that, like, the busyness of having an emergency and having things to occupy his mind and, you know, a pressure, something to snap him out of it, really helps with his mental, what's the word? Mental state, I guess. The state feels like too strong a term, though, because that makes it sound more permanent. It helps him cope, really, is a better way to say it, I think, with his tendency toward depression, really, is like the word I want, and I'm not sure that's exactly correct, but she is wondering how long this can last and figuring like it won't be too long before he starts to come down off of the adrenaline and starts to overthink things again, which honestly I felt very attacked by. This is something that I have really struggled with. Is I am a similar way. I think a lot of people who are neurodivergent and deal with like mental health issues and depression are this way as well. And it's part of why people talk about the importance of like a routine. And you guys, I cannot tell you how many times in my life I have attempted to institute a routine. And this applies to when I had regular jobs as well as to now working from home. And I have certainly had times where I have to get up and go to work at my regular job, you know, when I was working at the bank or when I was working at Starbucks or whatever. And I didn't want to go into work. And there was a big part of me that just felt like I can't face this today. And I just got it together and I went into work and I wound up being fine. But at the beginning of the day, I would have told you with absolute certainty, I'm not going to make it through. I can't do it. And it turns out that when I was out of an environment that allowed me to overthink, such as an empty, quiet house, and I am in amongst people with things to do and folks who are sort of depending on me, all of a sudden I am a lot better, like 80% better, I'm talking. But I really, if I was given the option, told, you can stay home today and nothing bad will happen to you and your friends will have, you know, they will find someone to replace you, I would have stayed home. And it would have been worse. And yet, even knowing that, it can be hard because sometimes you push yourself to go do a thing and it winds up worse after because you're doing something to sort of avoid your emotions or you're trying to like bottle things up. And it becomes a real trick trying to figure out which is which and knowing when you should try and push yourself and when pushing yourself is not actually going to be helpful or productive. And then you add in somebody like me who I want routine, like in theory, but I feel like this weird defiance as well. So if somebody tries to impose routine upon me, I push back because I'm don't like being told what to do. And if I try to create a routine for myself, I struggle so much with that kind of self-discipline that I don't follow through because I feel like, well, I just can't today. And I probably could. It's a really frustrating place to be. And I just understood Hugh's position here a lot. And in amongst all of that, Sabe is kind of freaking out. Personally, we get her like not being certain whether or not the sacred swordmaster was actually the first person she's killed. There was one other person that she thinks she may have killed, but she doesn't know for sure. However, it's like only if it isn't her first kill, only her second. And she very, very nearly died. Like it was a super close thing. And she is struggling to keep it together and not show everybody how rattled she is, which is kind of funny because later on there's a whole thing with Talia opening up and talking to them about how she wants to be more honest about how she feels. And they're all very encouraging with that. But Sabe isn't entirely being open with them herself here. And like, I don't think she has told any of them about what the coup is. Like, I think it's explicitly mentioned that she hasn't shared it with them. And I'm kind of side-eyeing her at this point for keeping that to herself. I don't really know why she thinks that she gets to know and that the others don't. Like, it's one thing to engage in that conversation with Alustin without the others because you're not certain yet. But once you know and he like confirms everything, why not share it with them? What does she see them as just like less mature than her and less able to handle it? So yeah, there's this, like they all sit, they all have some, I think fish stew of some kind. And they start talking about the situation with these Havathi and the weapons that they use, because Hugh expresses some frustration that they didn't keep a weapon that probably would have been really good for Sabe to have because it was lightning. And Alustin's like, yeah, but she can't do like ranged attacks, so it really wouldn't have worked that well for her. But he says the sacred swordsmen are all warlocks, ones who exclusively pact with magical weapons. There are some limitations to what magical weapons they can pact with. They need to have artificial mana reservoirs, but when they do, they gain the affinities used in creating the weapons, an unusual amount of control of the weapon, and often a few odd abilities related to the enchantment of the weapon. The weapon, in turn, grows gradually more powerful, slowly grows its mana reservoirs, and even tends to become intelligent. The oldest weapons used by the swordsmen have grown alarmingly powerful, and many are actively loyal to the Havathi dominion. Needle of Leagues is one of the oldest weapons of the swordsmen. It never would have accepted serving anyone else. Grovebringer, the bow that created the forest out there, is another of their oldest and most powerful weapons. I like to think Ampiok wanted to keep the weapons out of Havathi hands, but most likely he intends to gift the younger weapons to his own warlocks if he has any, and likely intends to ransom back the Needle of Leagues to Havath. If I thought I could have gotten away with it, I would have kept it. So this is a really neat idea, and like, you know, the whole concept of having been pacted to a weapon, it's been mentioned, but the details here I find pretty interesting, and the ways that like the weapon can become intelligent. I wonder what that manifests as. Like, how does that look, you know? What happens if Havath gets to Imperial Ithos first and claims the exile splinter? Alustin shrugged. It would probably take them years, perhaps decades, to figure out its use. They have a handful of crystal mages, but none as brilliant as Kandaron. Still, for someone as long-lived as Kandaron, that's a short enough time period to be unacceptable. More concerning to me would be the likelihood they recover enchanted items from the ruins of Imperial Ithos. There were quite a number of extraordinarily powerful ones lost with the city. And then he mentions liches. Perhaps the odds that some Ithonian mage managed to transition into lichdom, and is hanging around still, but that seems unlikely. Liches were rare prior to the fall of the Ithonian Empire, and they destroyed many of the existing ones over the centuries of their expansion. Liches and empires don't get along well. And this is an interesting thing because liches are a creature type that you see in a lot of like fantasy, and in D&D campaigns is like one of the first places that I came across them. But I like feel like every time I run across them, they're sort of different. And we get a description here, given their largely stationary nature and their strong incentives to maintain a close control of their I think he calls this their domains. Demesnes is what it looks like it's spelled, but I can't remember. I'm going to see if the little built-in thing with Kindle will give me a pronunciation here. Because I've kept, I think, believing in the audiobook that he was saying domains, and then being like, that doesn't, he's saying it so weird. It has to be a different word. But anyway, liches would be a major thorn in the side of anyone who wanted to expand their power widely. Yeah, domain. Okay. Yeah. None of the liches of the Endless Urg or the southwest coast of the Ithonian continent were particularly powerful, but the Kaendas family had cultivated alliances with as many as possible. They were useful tools for preventing expansionist ambitions in the region. Not to mention, reliable allies that stuck around for centuries were rare enough. Few families or great powers were stable over the long term. So, what I keep picturing here is somebody who looks kind of like a old-fashioned Bram Stoker kind of vampire, and is sort of like ancient and husk-like, but I don't know if that's even close to what they look like here. So Arthur gets up and says for Hugh to join him when he's done, because he has a project he wants to go over with him. And Alustin says that he is going to report to Candoron that the Sacred Swordsmen were active so close to her territory. And he mentions this right in front of Hugh, but it does not occur to Hugh that he should also report to Candoron, which comes up later. So this is when Godric starts talking about the sword. He says that was a Halokatan saber. Drake shit, Talia said. There's no way. What's a Halokatan saber? Hugh asked. Everyone stared at Hugh. Have you literally never heard of Halok? I feel like in the audiobook she says helicote, but I keep doing a sort of pronunciation akin to like Hecate in my head when I see it written down. Helokate. But I'm going to do helicote because over time, I think I'm just going to wind up adopting the way he says it in the audiobook anyway, so I may as well be consistent. There's no way it's an actual Halokatan saber. Only Halokatans can wield them, and there aren't any more. And I'm just like, yeah, well, it looks like maybe there are, though. Helicote was a city-state in eastern Ithos, a few days south of Sarnasis' southern border. It wasn't a particularly large or powerful city-state, but it was old and highly respected. It was known for its swords. Their ruler, the Lord of Bells, was one of the greatest enchanters ever. He forged every single one of their sabers personally. The enchantments aren't inlaid. They're actually folds in the metal that he beat into him during the forging process somehow. They're nigh indestructible, sharp enough to cut through any lesser weapons, and can leave those deadly after images. Murder echoes, Talia said. It apparently took years to learn to master one of them, Sebe said. You had to start training as soon as you could walk, Godric interrupted again. wearing a blindfold all the time to master your situational awareness, because those after images, murder echoes, are just as dangerous to the wielder as their opponent, which that caught me short. I was expecting that you create these after images and you yourself can walk through them, but your opponent can't. But evidently, no, they can fuck you up as well, which just doesn't seem entirely fair. Like, come on, it's your own weapon. Like, that just seems... Granted, you can cut yourself on your own sword and blades, whatever. Those are regular things, though. Like, come on. And they had some sort of enchantment that kept anyone not Helokatan from using them. And there really aren't any Helokatans left, so there must have been some weird counterfeit. And Sabe just sighs because she keeps being interrupted. If Godric's right, Alustin would have to be Helokatan, which would be huge. Why doesn't Helicote exist anymore? I think it's Helicotan is the way they keep saying it. If it's Helicote, then Helicotan would make more sense than Helokatan. Helikatan. Oh my god, you guys. Help. I'm drowning. Because Helicote picked a fight with the Havath Dominion single-handed and almost won. It started over 20 years ago. Havath's last major war of expansion had been halted by a huge alliance of nations, city-states, and various powers. That was the war that Selasa Tidecaller and Arthur both made their names in as mercenaries. Headmaster Tarek fought in it as well, but she was already famous. Helicote had served in that alliance, but by the time Havath was forced to a halt, Helicote went from being weeks away from Havathi territory to being right up against the border of the Dominion. The war bankrupted and crippled both Havath and the alliance that fought them, so both sides were still licking their wounds and recovering. Helicote, however, knew it was only a matter of time until Havath tried again, and this time there wasn't much chance of the alliance reforming in time to keep Helicote independent. The Lord of Bells wasn't the one who decided to attack. It was the Helicotan Forum who decided to. The Lord of Bells allowed the dwellers in his domain to considerably more independence and power than many liches do, and the Lord citizens of the Forum decided they would try to disrupt Havath rebuilding. They managed to convince the Lord of Bells to back their effort, and a city of less than 100,000 souls invaded an empire of millions. It wasn't a normal invasion, though. They didn't have great power to lead it. The Lord of Bells could no more leave his domain than any other lich, and they were outnumbered to a ridiculous degree. Havath had over a dozen great powers of its own, and countless archmages on top of that. Helicote had a few advantages, of course. Helicotan mages were notoriously dangerous, well-trained, and numerous for a city their size. And they started on a campaign of mass assassination rather than attacking head-on. They destroyed infrastructure, sabotaged dams, poisoned wells. It took 2 weeks for Havath to fully mobilize against the threat, and by then their economy had been crippled for years to come, and they'd suffered a massive loss of institutional and bureaucratic expertise. But mobilize they did, and they crushed Helicote. It took almost a year, but they hunted down every saboteur and assassin, and eventually managed to slay the Lord of Bells and destroy Helicote itself. It took the lives of 3 of their own great powers to do so. So, yeah, this is, he was like, I don't understand why they would do something. Why would they do a thing like this? And Sabe says, I don't know. It's almost like they kind of lost their heads for a second. Like they're maybe prideful, but even so, they did as much damage to Havath as the last war had done, and there hasn't been another major war of expansion since. I'm telling you, it makes perfect sense. He's about the right age, and there's the whole walking backwards bit, not to mention his obvious grudge against Havath. And his paper affinity would explain why he was sent to Skyhold, Sabe said. The Lord citizens of Hellicote valued their abilities as warriors equally as highly as their artistic or scholarly talents. A paper mage would have been considered useless as a battle mage, so he gets sent away when his affinities develop, which I'm guessing was probably a year or two before Hellicote invaded Havath, and it explains how he survived Havath's purge. And they talk about like whether or not Archer knows this, and basically Godric is like, my dad doesn't tell me a lot of stuff, so he may know about this and he wouldn't say anything to me about it. Like, basically the overall vibe is, if my dad knows something secret about a person, he's not going to tell. He's not the type. Which, good for you, Archer. I wish I could say the same, but I can be kind of a blabbermouth, as you guys know. And then Hugh gets up to leave. Sabé can see that he's starting to slip back into his sadness. And then Talia, they have an intervention, Sabé and Godric, about her being into Hugh. And Godric, falling in love is like farting. You can try and keep it hidden, but it'll make itself known eventually. Talia actually giggled a little in surprise at that. And she says, like, I just didn't know how I felt, or I told myself I didn't know how I felt. And she says, I tried to pretend, I didn't have any feelings. I felt like an idiot ever since talking to Ava. You talked to Ava? Is she all right? You didn't injure her, did you? I love this moment. And Sabé just genuinely being like, oh God, what did you do? And she says, no, we've talked and I don't have any problem with her, which catches Sabé way off guard. And we have a moment here with Sabé after this conversation, because they just sort of, end it with her thinking over how she's going to talk to him and saying that she's going to take some time. Sabé dreamt of being on a floating disc over a sea of magma, waves of molten rock cresting above her, of an armored figure crackling and lightning floating above the magma, pointing a harpoon at her. And I was like, girl, you're having like these nightmares. I really feel like you do want to talk to your friends about the effect that fight had on you. And she's still refusing to do that. Again, there's something about Sabé that I feel like she sees herself as almost a maternal figure. Not exactly that, but like, I think she definitely imagines herself to be the adult of the group in a way. And so she doesn't want to tell them just as much to sort of protect them, which is misguided, but I don't know. That's sort of the energy that I get off her. So we have her looking at the window and some like thoughts about the way that the city is set up and the extra walls of basalt and stuff to guard against storm surges and keep the bay like calm and manageable as well. And Ampiak himself, it turns out, doesn't go into like the deeps anymore, and he's made a lot of enemies, so that's why he avoids it. But there's also a theory that maybe he's been officially exiled, and nobody actually knows for sure which one of those it is. And Sabé thought about her mother serving as a storm mage escort to trade fleets. She didn't feel as much bitterness toward her as she used to, but it wasn't gone entirely. Sabé wondered how often her mother thought of her these days. It was a long time until Sabé turned away from the window to try and get back to sleep. And I do have to admit that I am kind of curious in general about how often our friends stay in touch with their parents. Like we've got Godric's dad right here, but we haven't really heard much from Sabé's parents. They're both alive, right? And we have met Sabé's, or not Sabé's parents, Talia's parents. They're still alive, right? And Sabé's mother is alive, but her father died? I know she told us this story. But the fact that there haven't been really any letters, I mean, they've both, Sabé and Talia have come close to dying, and their parents don't seem to have reached out. What's that about? Chapter 8. There's this interesting moment here where they're all waiting, looking for their ship to come in, and Talia spots a Radan ship. And she starts to get really self-conscious about the fact that if there are any pretty Radhan girls on there, they might remind Hugh of Ava, and he might be drawn to them simply because they remind him of somebody that he used to care about, and that they're going to be prettier than her, and they're going to flirt with him. And she just walks up behind him and shoves him off the edge of the pier and catches himself. He catches himself with a cantrip, but it's just like, what the fuck was that for? And she says that it's because he was spacing out, and that he needs to stay more alert, because what if they try to make trouble and you're just like in La La Land? And both Sabe and Godric look at Talia and are like, dude, seriously? What the fuck? And Talia immediately realizes that she's fucked up. She's just like, oh my God, what am I fucking thinking? And Hugh, like, he of course he's going to flirt with somebody else now, because why would he flirt with a girl who just tried to shove him off a pier? There were, to her immense displeasure, there wasn't just one beautiful Radan girl on board. There were several, and cute boys as well, for that matter. She was fairly sure Hugh was only attracted to girls, but given how much of an idiot she was, they likely still had more of a chance with Hugh than she did. And she winds up eventually apologizing to him, and it turns into this whole thing that I really liked. But I'm going to have to pick up my pace here, because holy shit, you guys, look, it's like, I'm like 40 minutes in, but I wanted to talk about every aspect of the thing with Olustin's potential heritage. So I'm having more and more trouble fitting these into the time limits. I'm like, maybe in the future we should do 40 pages per episode, Dan. But the whole thing here is we're with Hugh, and he is struggling, knowing that he's like irritating other people, and he's also irritating himself. And he's in his bunk, and there's this sound, and it turns out that it's the book that that Kandaron gave him to communicate with. And she's just like, dude, a huge thing happened, and you didn't even check in with me. What the hell? And he's like, look, my bad. I'm not used to doing this, and I'm just, And then I love this, as he's writing in it, Hugh's spellbook starts to lean in and be like, what the fuck? Like, get this real aggressive sort of energy. And he realizes it's jealous, which leads to it eating this book later, which may become a real problem. We shall see. But basically, there's this moment, I really appreciated this. Hugh decides to report, but he tells Kandaron everything about how he's feeling. And the weird shame he has, even though he knows he did the right thing with killing that spotter, and missing Ava, and feeling really petty for missing Ava, even though there's other bigger things to worry about. And we get a beautiful response from Kandaron. And it's been highlighted a number of times. In all my centuries of life, Hugh, if there's one thing I've learned, it's that emotions cannot truly be controlled. They can't be harnessed, and they will never obey your expectations. We can control our reactions to our emotions, and we can slowly wrestle them in the directions we desire, but we will always have to understand them and fight them on their own grounds, which is to say, we have to understand ourselves. And this is something that I think when people think of, therapy, a lot of folks who don't have experience with it imagine that going to therapy is just like a way for you to figure out who to blame your problems on. And there's a lot of especially boomers, their mentality is sort of, always blame the parents and never take responsibility. But that's actually the opposite of what therapy is supposed to do. You may be able to look at behaviors from your parents and that will inform you on where your patterns come from. And you can certainly link those and be like, oh, that's why I do X, Y, Z. But it's also important within that framework of recognizing where certain things originate to take responsibility for your own actions. And despite the fact that the origin of those actions may come from some really valid trauma or dysfunction, ultimately, you as a grown-up are making choices, you know, as a grown-up asterisk, like depending on your age, but you as a person are still making choices that are in your control to make. And there comes a point where just being like, well, I'm fucked up, that's not an explanation. That's not a reason. That's not actually taking responsibility. It's kind of acting as if, because I'm not a perfectly adjusted person, then everything I do should be excused. So anyway, I just like this emphasis of understanding yourself is a big thing. Like, and you catch yourself having these emotional reactions to things and kind of going, okay, wait, I just got really disproportionately angry about this thing that I know rationally isn't actually that important. And where is that coming from? And a friend of mine recently shared that something she says to herself in those moments is, this feeling is valid, but it's not necessarily true. You know, this thought that, oh, so-and-so is trying to do a thing to me. It may be valid that you think that because of various things in your history, but it's not necessarily a true thing. And you have to sort through it all. And then, as much as some fools crave it, all attempts to become beings of unalloyed logic and reason fail. And I have been saying this for a minute because there has been such an emphasis in the past 5 years or so with these fucking bro reply guys talking about how people don't want to be logical. And it's like they're trying to completely divorce emotion from the conversation as if it's an invalid thing, when in fact trying to divorce emotion is the invalid thing. That's the problem. You can't do that. That's not how human beings work. And ironically, a lot of the people saying that sort of thing are some of the most emotional people you'll ever fucking meet. And she talks about dealing with emotions and learning to incorporate experience with the new things that you learn and go through, and how nothing will ever truly go away, but they'll become diluted. They'll be mixed in with other things and grow less powerful sometimes. And it was a really sweet thing. And there's this long pause, and he was really taken aback and crying over the warmth of this response. And then she says, anyhow, when you keep humans as pets, you need to tend to their emotional health as well as physical. It's just good sense. And he realizes that Candoron is just kind of trying to backpedal after being very vulnerable and emotional for a moment. And that tracks for me. This is also how I tend to be. I'll be really, really open and expressive, and then I'll make a joke. Then I'll sort of back off, and it's not the best, but I am trying. But yeah, I just really liked this whole section, and the fact that, I said in the last bit how Candoron seemed to be so dismissive of how he was feeling and really minimizing it. And it was just really nice to actually see Candoron respond to Hugh in a real way here that gave him space and validated the fact that he is feeling these things. And I needed that for him, I just feel like nobody has really been as patient with him as I want them to be. So he comes out onto deck, and there's a whole thing with them actually going onto the sea, because Talia is super worried that she's going to be seasick, and it turns out she's not. And I'm really curious if we're going to find out why that is. But the they head out there, and there's a lot of discussion between, like, inside everybody's heads. I shouldn't say discussion, but it's like more than one character thinks to themselves about how often they call something by the wrong name, and that Sabe would have corrected them because she's very insistent on using the right names for parts of a ship. And I think it's Godric's head we're in when he's like, it just feels really unnecessary to give everything a different name, to which I fucking agree 100%. I just don't see the point. Now, maybe there is a point that you could explain to me if I cared enough to listen, but I don't. It's fine. Let's see. I forgot about this moment. Alustin uses an origami golem to talk to them while he's like up in the air. It's a little one shaped like an octopus. Hugh looked up to see Alustin waving at them. "What are you doing up there?" Godric asked. "I like having a good view," Alustin said. The tall sailor lowered his eyeglass and said something, but his words didn't come through the origami octopus. "I'm wounded you'd think my motives would be so base," Alustin said, though he didn't actually sound offended. "I'll have you know," Sabe interrupted. "We can still hear you, Alustin." "Ah, right. Well, I meant to give you a bit of history lesson, but for now, why don't you just go ahead and enjoy the view? Of the ocean, that is." So this was apparently them realizing that he was flirting. I will tell you what, kids, I did not get that at all. It wasn't until Sabe says, I liked it better when he hid his flirtations, that I was like, oh, is that what's happening? Like, the whole bit was a little bit confusing. I think him saying I'm having a good view is supposed to be him saying that he's looking at the sailor. But I just wasn't picking that up at all. But anyway, let's see. Hugh starts to create this piece of crystal, and he is adding all of these spell forms to it. When it gently floated over to him and began orbiting his head, he exhaled softly. The court simply kept orbiting his head without him needing to pay attention to it. In addition, it used so little mana that his reservoirs could easily refill from the ether around him faster than it could drain away. So he does this right before Talia comes over to talk to him, which results in the bizarre ending to their little conversation, which was honestly really, really funny. But she comes up and she says that she wants to apologize and that she gets aggressive when she's nervous. And everybody is like, "No, really, you think?" And she's obviously kind of embarrassed that they are all so aware of this with her. Like, one thing I do enjoy about Talia is she comes to the right conclusion about herself eventually, but it takes her so much longer than it takes literally anybody else. And how, like, resentful she is initially at noticing that everybody else has already figured this out. It's the same thing as, like, you know, the fact that she has a crush on Hugh, but also the fact that everybody else can see it. She immediately is sort of like, okay, fair, and like gets over it. And Hugh says, if it was that big a deal, we would have told you to stop. And everybody looks at Hugh and he's like, all right, I wouldn't have, but probably Godric or Sabe would have done something. And Talia, to her credit, says it might not be a big deal to you guys, but it is to me. I don't want to just be a jerk to hide my emotions, and I don't want to hit my friends like some spoiled child. Hugh almost said something snarky, then stopped. Talia might be tougher than him, but he knew how hard it was to confess difficult things, even to friends. So he hugs her and tells her, I appreciate the effort, and just, you know, be easy on yourself because making changes takes some time. And as she starts to reply, she was interrupted not by a person, but by Hugh's new crystal running into the side of her head. It slowly rolled across her cheek, then tumbled off her nose at glacial speeds. maybe I should just have it float over my shoulder, Hugh said. I think that might be for the best, Godric said, visibly struggling to contain his laughter. Honestly, that cracked me up. I like just the image of it very slow. Oh my God. So let's see, man, old philosophies. So you guys, I just am not going to have time to talk about all of this. I'm so sorry. We have this lesson time where everybody gets given something to work on while Alustin lectures them. And Hugh is trying to make a salt crystal. Sabe is sustaining like wind armor on one arm and water armor on her other. Godric is trying to hold back the smell of the salt air with his scent affinity. And Hugh is, oh no, I already mentioned Hugh. Talia is holding a bone and sending mana into it without exploding. So they're all working on this while he is talking to them about affinities and the ways that some of them work. And this was actually really interesting. And he says that him and Arthur have decided that they're all a little bit too focused on their particular specialties and that they need to get used to thinking about how other affinities work so that they know how to counter them. And let's see. Quite a few mages have developed entirely new techniques and spells by studying affinities other than their own. And Godric is like, oh yeah, my dad's developed his armor after studying illusion magic and figuring out how to make it work. Dad figured out how to pull it off by modifying the techniques illusionists use when they create illusions based off physical objects, which I can assure you, Alustin said, isn't nearly as easy as it sounds. Plenty of people have tried to mimic Archer's approach, but there's clearly more to it than just that. I've met few other mages as brilliant as Archer. So I'm going to be over the summer introducing you to other abilities, and he starts by talking about shadow affinity and is like, so what's the deal with shadow affinity, do you think? Because what is a shadow? And when they say a lack of light, he's like, yeah, and it's really weird to have an affinity that's like, oh, I'm going to control the lack of something. Like, what else does that? And Talia is finally like, so is it actually light? And he's like, kind of. It's a compound affinity. There are two entirely different forms of shadow affinity. And he talks about 6 different types of ice affinity. And stone affinities get brought up because of Godric and, you know, some people being able to handle other stones more easily than others. So let's see, there are structural affinities like crystal or fiber, which target structures or arrangements of material rather than varieties of material. There are monolithic affinities like solar, wind, or flame, which only affect a single material in a single manner. And Talia says that the fire affinity is a compound, but she says, Sabe says, my family suspects there are different types of wind affinity too. We suspect air has different components. I haven't spent a lot of time looking into it, but some of my family believe it's why a candle goes out when you place a glass jar over it, because it's burned through some component of the air as fuel. So yeah, this is a neat idea. And I really like the concept of like taking sort of the physics of things into account and looking into whether or not the opposing materials that somebody needs to adjust for, that might be part of what they're controlling as well. So the shadow affinities, one is a close relative of light, acts as a light barrier and creates shadows. It can be used to turn invisible and has limited illusion generating ability. That's the easiest way to identify a light-based illusion, looking for missing shadows. Other illusions based in different affinities have different weaknesses you can learn to identify. The other shadow affinity is a lot more interesting for our purposes. He can make Eudaxus can make shadows tangible, transmit his voice through them, even teleport through them across short distances, which by and large is one of the rarest abilities any affinity can have. of course, Eudaxus is one of the most powerful shadow mages alive. His variety of shadow affinity is sometimes called a darkness or night affinity, but I prefer simply calling it a greater shadow affinity, less ambiguous and confusing to my mind. And the concept of this, I just think it's a really neat idea of there being like more than one type. I think that makes a lot of sense. Some things certain people are able to master and others aren't. It also allows for the writer to be able to do some creative things and make it so that not every character can do everything, you know? There is a lot of talk here about the meta affinity thing. And I am not going to get into this too much because, again, time. But this is something that I barely understood. I am not going to lie to you guys. And I may have to like reread this section because I kept like, it felt like my brain just shut off two sentences into the paragraph explaining this. Eudaxus and other greater shadow users seem to be able to, for lack of a better description, trick places into thinking that they are other places with other properties, or even to link them together somehow, almost as though the lack of light inside a shadow makes its contents less certain and less real, which is really an odd thought. So... Man, I'm like, you guys, I'm looking at my time. I'm pretty much at time now. I still have like a couple pages of this chapter and I have the whole next chapter. Chapter 10, Unfortunate Dietary Choices, is where we find out that the book, Hugh's spell book, ate the Candoron book and it's acting really weird and basically kind of like vomiting, which Arthur says could be a real problem because that book, those types of transmission books contain a lot of energy and could blow out the side of the ship. And there is an attack from some sea serpents. And I want to talk about it, but I'm really going to have to like get on my time. There were a lot of like sort of emotional moments and big history reveals that deserved a lot of attention this time around. So I don't regret spending extra time on them, but I feel bad that I'm going to have to sort of smush it in. But yeah, this whole thing about the meta affinity and like the spots in space that they take up and that there's like places that intersect, the whole thing boils down to Alustin basically being like, yeah, Talia, please research this and also research the fact that the creators of this thing don't think it does exist. And she's like, this is the worst assignment, literally, out of all of them. I hate this more than any of them. And that is pretty much the end of that chapter. So I'm going to do chapter 10 more justice next time. But suffice to say, a whole bit with the sea serpents is definitely going to be a rollicking good time, I have to assume. We've got a lot going on here. So I'm looking forward to seeing how this works as well, because Sabe winds up like going into the water and coming across a bunch of baby ones, which, look, if there is one thing that I am not a fan of, it is the idea of trying to fight something in its element rather than your element. And being in water, because of the way that something could come at you from literally any direction and you're just hovering helpless, absolutely not. So count me out. All right, guys, I'm going to wrap up. Promise that I will do that more justice next time. Appreciate all your patience. And until next time, toodaloo, motherfuckers.